At dawn on April 30th, 1943, the sea was glass. Just off the coast of Huelva, Spain, a fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria steered his small wooden boat toward shore. The air smelled of salt and diesel. The gulls were loud that morning, circling something in the water ahead. When he drew closer, he saw a shape. A man in a British naval uniform, face down, arms spread, drifting with the tide. The sea had kept him intact, pale, bloated, but strangely peaceful. A leather attaché case was still chained to his wrist. The fisherman crossed himself. Then he called for help. By mid-morning, the body had been brought to land. Spanish civil guards stood around it, whispering. The tag on the uniform read, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. His boots were polished, his watch still working, his pockets full of the small things that made a man real. In the inside pocket of his jacket, they found a photograph, a smiling young woman with dark hair, signed, All My Love, Pam. In another, ticket stubs from a theater in London, letters from a fiancé, a bill from a tailor on Savile Row. Everything about him spoke of a life, routine, ordinary, believable. The Spanish coroner noted that he must have drowned. The case on his wrist, still locked, looked important. The local police contacted the British consulate. News spread fast. Within a day, the German attaché in Madrid had heard of it. A dead officer. A secret case. A chance for intelligence. It seemed almost too perfect. But no one questioned it. Not yet. The Germans immediately pressed their Spanish contacts to gain access to the documents. Spanish officials, sympathetic to Berlin but cautious of London, stalled. They performed a perfunctory autopsy, wrote a death certificate, and confirmed the man had perished at sea. The British consul thanked them, looking solemn, pretending to grieve for a man who had never lived. That same night, in London, a coded message reached the Admiralty. Body recovered. Papers expected in German hands soon. The operation had begun, quietly, efficiently, exactly as planned. No one in Huelva could have guessed that the drowned officer wasn't a hero at all, but a fiction built from the imagination of Britain's most secret minds. To the Spanish, he was a tragedy. To the Germans, an opportunity. To the British, he was bait. The next morning, newspapers reported the discovery. Locals spoke of the Englishman from the sea. Priests prayed for his soul. His body was buried with military honors in a Catholic cemetery under a marble cross that read, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Died in service. And so, the illusion was complete. Every pocket of the dead man had been prepared. Ticket stubs, bills, keys, letters, all meant to tell one simple story, that he had been on a mission from London to North Africa, and that he had died when his plane crashed into the sea. The chain on the briefcase was the final touch, the symbol of a man so loyal. He died with his secrets. But those secrets were lies. Inside the briefcase lay forged papers, letters between British generals discussing a fake Allied invasion of Greece and Sardinia. Not a word about the real target, Sicily. The trick had to work. Thousands of soldiers' lives depended on it. Back in Spain, the German agent Adolf Hitler took note of every detail. He described the man's uniform, the authenticity of the documents, even the saltwater stains. By May 2nd, the contents of the briefcase were in German hands. Within 3 days, they were on Hitler's desk. The deception was alive. Meanwhile, in London, a small group of intelligence officers waited in silence, smoking, watching the clock. They knew that if the ruse was believed, the Germans would move their forces away from Sicily, and if it failed, thousands of Allied troops would die on the beaches. But for now, all they could do was wait and pray that the dead man's story would live long enough to save the living. The fisherman who had found the body never learned who Major Martin really was. Years later, he still told the same story in the taverns of Huelva, how the sea had delivered an English officer, a man with a kind face and a locked briefcase. He didn't know that, somewhere far above his quiet Spanish coast, that same briefcase was already rewriting the course of the war. And yet, Major William Martin had been dead weeks before he ever hit the water. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They said it was madness. Churchill called it brilliant madness. London, January 1943. Deep beneath the city, in a damp, windowless room known only as Room 13, 2 men stared at a map of Europe lit by a single bulb. The air smelled of tobacco and fear. Above them, the world burned. Here, they plotted how to fool the devil himself. Ewan Montague of Naval Intelligence, precise, polished, a lawyer turned spymaster, leaned over the table. Across from him sat Flight Lieutenant Charles Chumley, a man with a sharp nose and stranger ideas. Between them lay a proposal so improbable it bordered on lunacy, to use a dead body to plant false intelligence where the Germans would find it. The plan had been whispered before, in a 1939 memo titled the Trout Memorandum. Most dismissed it as dark humor, the type of deception suitable for a novel. But Montague saw more. "The dead will be our best messengers," he said. "They tell no tales, they keep no secrets, and they cannot be tortured." The goal was audacious. Convince Hitler that the Allies would invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily, their true target. If the Germans swallowed it, they would divert their divisions, leaving Sicily exposed. But the question was how to make a lie feel like truth. First, they needed a body. Not just any corpse. One that could convincingly pass as a British officer who died in a plane crash at sea. The documents had to look soaked but legible, the uniform authentic, the personal items heartbreakingly human. Every detail had to tell a story. Chumley outlined it in his journal that night. He must be a man with a life, not just a death. A man someone will believe existed. The brass were skeptical. When Montague first presented the concept to the Naval Intelligence Board, one admiral reportedly muttered, "This is more grotesque theater than warfare." Another asked coldly, "And where exactly will you find a volunteer?" Montague didn't flinch. "We won't," he replied. "We'll find someone who can no longer object." Churchill, briefed on the operation weeks later, paused, then said with a grin, "You must succeed, and the sardines must swallow it whole." The codename was chosen almost as a joke, Operation Mincemeat. The minced meat of war turned into a weapon of deception. The planning began in earnest. In room 13, Montague and Chumley built their fiction piece by piece. A photograph of a sweetheart, ration tickets, a St. Christopher medallion, theater stubs from London's West End. They crafted letters between generals, alluding to fake operations and troop movements. Each sentence, each coffee stain, each fold of paper designed to whisper, "This is real." The personal file of Major William Martin, Royal Marines, was created in the Admiralty archives. Rank, date of birth, next of kin, all fabricated. They even registered him in the official Navy list. To the bureaucratic machine, he now existed. But while the paperwork grew, a darker question hung in the air. Where would they find the man himself? The perfect body, young enough to fit the role, unmarked enough to pass as a drowning victim, and, most importantly, unclaimed. One afternoon, Montague visited a morgue on the edge of London. The coroner looked at him suspiciously. "You're looking for something particular, sir?" Montague's reply was clinical, almost cold. "Someone who looks like an accident. Someone whose story can continue a little longer." Outside, the winter rain turned the city to glass. He knew the weight of what he was doing. For all their talk of strategy, this was a gamble played with the dignity of the dead. Still, there was no other way. The Allies were preparing to strike at the heart of Hitler's empire. If the deception failed, tens of thousands could die on the beaches of Sicily. If it worked, they might shorten the war itself. That night, in his report to his superior, Montague wrote one line that would later be found in the archives, underlined twice. "In this war, truth is a weapon, and sometimes it must be forged." He didn't sleep. None of them did. Room 13 became a place where day and night blended. Maps, typewriters, coffee, whispers. They laughed darkly at their own work, calling their creation the man who would save lives by dying twice. But even for men used to secrets, the morality of it hung heavy. When Chumley asked, "Do you ever wonder who he was?" Montague answered, "No. I only wonder who he'll become." By spring, the operation had approval from the highest levels. A body was found, the paperwork completed, the story ready. In the flicker of a dim desk lamp, Montague sealed the envelope containing the forged documents. On the flap, he wrote the name, Major William Martin. The world would never know the man who died to create him. All that was left was to give this ghost a face and a final mission. The man who would fool Hitler died alone in a London park, of rat poison and despair. The record said his name was Glynndwr Michael. No rank, no next of kin, no one to ask questions. He had drifted to London in the winter of 1943, a vagrant from Wales who'd been sleeping under bridges and in abandoned buildings. One night, desperate and half-starved, he ate bread laced with phosphorus meant to kill rats. He died 2 days later in St. Pancras Hospital, 34 years old, unclaimed, unnoticed. When the doctors wheeled his body to the morgue, no one imagined that it would soon be used to deceive an empire. But in war, even death can be repurposed. Weeks later, in that same morgue, 2 men stood in the dim light of the cold room. Their breath hung in the air like fog. The coroner lifted a sheet. "He's been here a while," he said quietly. "Lungs intact. Little sign of injury. Could pass for drowning, if you're careful." Montague and Chumley exchanged a look. There was no triumph in their eyes, only calculation and unease. This was the man they needed, a stranger with no one to miss him. "We'll take him," Montague said. Thus began the second life of Glynndwr Michael, a man who would never know the role he played in history. The transformation was painstaking. Over the next weeks, Room 13 became both laboratory and stage. Every item had to tell a consistent story, one believable enough to fool the most paranoid intelligence officers in Berlin. They started with identity. The birth of Major William Martin, Royal Marines. His papers declared he'd been educated at St. John's College, Cambridge. His naval identification card, perfectly forged, bore his photograph, a solemn, serious face taken from another officer's file. The signature beneath it was practiced again and again until it looked natural, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste. Then came the pocket litter, the small, intimate objects that made him real. Cigarette stubs, receipts from a London bar, a letter from his bank about an overdraft, 2 theater stubs for a ticket for 2, a bill for a new shirt. The smell of tobacco and paper made the fiction breathe. Most powerful of all was the love story. The team invented a fiancée named Pam. She was beautiful, clever, and heartbreakingly ordinary. Her photograph, actually that of an MI5 secretary, showed her smiling at the camera, head tilted slightly, eyes alive. The letter she wrote was tender and teasing. "Darling Bill, I do wish you'd be careful. I can't bear to think of you flying all over the place and never writing. I bought us a ring, just in case. Yours always, Pam." Montague read it aloud once and then, almost guiltily, slipped it into the wallet of the dead man. Every object, every fold, every stain mattered. The watch on his wrist was set to British time. His shoes scuffed just enough to look lived in. A Silver Street Christopher medal, patron saint of travelers, rested on his chest. And then came the heart of the deception, the letters of war. Forged correspondence between senior Allied commanders discussed an upcoming invasion of Greece and Sardinia, full of small, convincing details designed to hook a spy's attention. The tone was formal but urgent. It implied that Sicily was a diversion, a feint. The documents were placed in a black leather briefcase, handcuffed to his wrist with a chain, because that's what a man carrying the future of the war would do. Still, questions lingered. Would the body look authentic after weeks in the water? Could the deception survive scientific scrutiny? Montague consulted pathologists and submarine officers, timing how long the sea might preserve a corpse before it looked suspicious. They packed the lungs with fluid, added personal letters to explain the supposed flight path, from London to Algiers, and prepared the official death certificate. When the work was done, they stood in silence. Montague later wrote, "He lay there, not as a corpse, but as a creation. We had built a life around a death." They kept him frozen for 2 months in a morgue drawer, wrapped carefully in dry ice. The medical report said, for special preservation. Only a handful of people in Britain knew the truth. Outside that small circle, Major William Martin was now alive, listed in official Navy records, his name on rosters and paybooks. And soon, he would die again, this time, for a purpose. When Montague left the morgue that evening, he paused at the door. Behind him lay a man who had slipped through history unnoticed, now poised to change it. He whispered, "Rest well, Major. The next part's on us." The plan was almost ready. The forgeries were sealed, the legend built, the body chosen. All that remained was to send their ghost into the sea and hope the enemy would take the bait. But there was one final challenge: how to make the dead travel as if he'd fallen from the sky. At 4 a.m. on April 17, 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph broke the surface of the Mediterranean. The sea was calm, the sky moonless. Only the hiss of ballast tanks and the whisper of wind. No one spoke. The crew gathered on deck around a long canister lashed with ropes, a sealed metal container packed with dry ice. Inside it lay the man who didn't exist. Commander Bill Jewell stood by the railing, his breath clouding in the cold air. The orders from London had been clear: deliver the body to the Spanish coast and release it so the tide would carry it to shore. Spain was officially neutral but quietly sympathetic to Germany, the perfect channel for the deception. The men had been told almost nothing. To them, the cargo was a mystery. Someone finally whispered, "Is he one of ours?" Jewell hesitated. Then quietly, "Not exactly." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever this was, it wasn't a normal mission. They had carried torpedoes, spies, even gold before, but never a corpse. In the dark, Jewell read a short prayer. For the man who never lived, but whose death may save many. No one moved. A single lantern flickered against the wet steel of the submarine. The air smelled of oil and sea salt. Then the canister was opened. A rush of cold vapor spilled out, and the pale outline of the man appeared. Major William Martin, Royal Marines, dressed perfectly for duty, the briefcase chained to his wrist. The sailors shifted uneasily as Jewell gave the final order. Ready, they slid the body toward the edge. For a moment, it rested there, between the living and the deep. Then, with one slow push, it slipped beneath the waves. The water closed over it with barely a sound. A small wreath followed, tossed by one of the officers. "To the bravest man we never met," he said softly. The submarine lingered, engines idling. They watched the wreath drift until it vanished into the dark. The mission had taken less than 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, the fate of thousands had been set in motion. Below deck, the silence was heavy. The crew wanted to ask questions, but discipline held. Jewell returned to the chart room and marked a simple notation: 0400, operation complete. Then he locked the logbook. The next morning, as the Seraph submerged again and turned for home, the Mediterranean was quiet. The tide began its slow, deliberate work. Somewhere beneath that black surface, the current carried the dead man toward the Spanish shore. Every detail had been engineered to ensure discovery. The body had been placed near the coast of Huelva, where Spanish officials and the German agents who shadowed them were known to patrol. The documents in his briefcase had been treated with waxed envelopes so the salt water wouldn't destroy them. Even the decomposition had been calculated. 2 days in the sea would make the death look perfectly natural. Still, the risk was enormous. If Spanish authorities realized the body had been planted, or if the wrong people found it first, the entire operation and Britain's intelligence credibility could collapse overnight. Montague had written one last note to Jewell before departure. If the body drifts too far, the ruse dies with him. Now, as dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the submarine was already hundreds of miles away, its crew under orders never to speak of what they'd done. The man they had buried at sea would have no funeral, no ceremony, no name beyond the one he'd been given. But in that silence, in that calculated act of deceit, the most extraordinary message of the war had been set adrift. For hours, the waves carried him closer to shore. Fishermen later recalled seeing gulls circling a strange shape near the tide line. The morning sun caught the glint of his buttons, the chain of the briefcase. 3 days later, a Spanish fisherman hauling his nets spotted something pale among the waves. He called to his partner. They rowed closer. And there he was, a British officer, face down, uniform soaked, hands still chained to a black case. They didn't know it yet, but the man they pulled from the sea would soon deceive the most powerful intelligence service in the world. The fisherman touched his cap out of respect. "The Englishman," he said. "The sea has brought him home." Berlin received the cable on May 2, 1943. A British officer's body has been found off the coast of Spain. Confidential papers attached. No one in Berlin realized it yet, but that message was exactly what London wanted them to read. In the small Andalusian port of Huelva, fishermen had dragged the drowned man ashore days earlier. His uniform was tattered but unmistakably British, his boots polished, his wrists still cuffed to a leather case. Spanish civil guards, curious and cautious, notified local officials, and before long, the news reached the German consulate. The British vice-consul, acting his part with careful restraint, demanded the papers back. He feigned embarrassment and urgency, warning of grave consequences if the documents were lost. But behind his polite panic was deliberate theater. Every gesture meant to deepen the illusion that the dead man was real, that the contents of his briefcase mattered more than anyone could imagine. The Spanish, predictably, shared everything with the Germans. Colonel Karl Erich Kalenthal, the Abwehr's man in Welva, handled the documents personally. He was meticulous, experienced, and entirely convinced of his own brilliance. He'd spent months trying to intercept Allied intelligence. Now, the sea itself had delivered it to him. He opened the case under guard, spreading the papers across his desk under a single lamp. Everything smelled of salt and mildew. But the letters were authentic. British letterheads, creased envelopes, smudged ink. He read phrases aloud, tasting them. Operation Brimstone. Greece, diversionary movement through Sardinia. It was perfect. Too perfect. But Kalenthal's ego overruled his caution. He photographed every page and dispatched the microfilm to Berlin through diplomatic channels. 2 days later, Hitler's intelligence staff examined the material in the Reich Chancellery. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and nervous excitement. Around the table sat the men who built and dismantled nations. Admiral Donitz, General Jodl, and the Führer himself. They pored over the documents like priests studying scripture. "These letters confirm what I always believed," Hitler said, tapping the papers. "The Allies are fools. They'll strike where we least expect, in Greece. They cannot resist the Balkans. That is where they'll bleed themselves." Donitz nodded reluctantly. "But my Führer, Sicily remains the logical target. It commands." Hitler slammed his fist on the table. "Logic is the trap of small minds. This," he pointed to the forged documents, "is intelligence." That single declaration changed the course of the war. Orders went out immediately. Redeploy divisions from Sicily to the Aegean, strengthen defenses in Greece, fortify Crete. Entire squadrons of aircraft were reassigned, tanks shipped, ships redirected. The Nazi war machine turned to face an enemy that did not exist. Meanwhile, in London, Montagu and his team waited in a suffocating silence. They had sent their ghost into the sea and could only pray that it reached the right eyes. For days, no confirmation came. Then one morning, as dawn broke over Whitehall, a courier burst into room 13. Intercept from Enigma. High priority. The codebreakers had decrypted a transmission from Berlin to Madrid. The words were cautious but unmistakable. Documents recovered from drowned English courier believed genuine. Führer satisfied with intelligence. Expect Allied assault on Greece and Sardinia. Montagu leaned back, hands trembling slightly. He whispered to Chumley, "They've taken it. Every bloody word." The room erupted, not in cheers, but in quiet disbelief. They had pulled off the impossible. They had fooled Hitler himself. But the euphoria didn't last. With success came a darker realization that their deception would send thousands of men, enemy soldiers or not, into battles that would never happen. "We've saved lives," Montagu said quietly, "but not everyone's." In the weeks that followed, the Germans executed their false strategy with frightening efficiency. Radio intercepts showed troop movements through the Balkans. Luftwaffe recon flights circled the Greek coast. Italian generals complained about the withdrawal of reinforcements from Sicily, but their protests were ignored. By June, the real Allied plan, Operation Husky, was in its final stages. Eisenhower's forces prepared to land in Sicily, where defenses had been fatally weakened by the lie born in room 13. The deception had worked so perfectly that it echoed across the entire German chain of command. Even Japanese intelligence cabled Berlin, congratulating them on the timely discovery of British incompetence. Back in Spain, the body of Major William Martin was buried with full military honors. The British vice-consul attended the funeral in a dark suit, head bowed. A wreath was laid at the grave. The inscription read, "Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Died serving his king and country. April 24, 1943. No one there knew his real name. No one guessed that he was a Welsh drifter who had died of despair in a cold London hospital. Yet now, His borrowed identity had changed the course of history. The Spanish returned the briefcase to the British embassy days later, apologizing profusely for the unfortunate loss of life. But by then, the copies had already been analyzed, catalogued, and transmitted to Berlin. When the courier delivered the news to Montague, he smiled faintly. Handled delicately, the report said, but examined. That was all he needed. The deception was complete. A man who never lived had convinced Hitler to move half an army. In London, the team gathered one last time in room 13. They didn't celebrate. They just stared at the photograph on the table, the smiling face of Pam, the fiancée who never existed. Montague folded the image carefully and said, "He's done his part. Now it's up to the living." Outside, the city was wrapped in blackout. The air smelled of rain and coal smoke. Somewhere beyond the channel, the tides were shifting again, this time carrying real soldiers toward real battlefields. The ghost of Major William Martin had done his work. And as London slept, the lie kept marching across Europe. Berlin received the cable on May 2, 1943. A British officer's body has been found off the coast of Spain. Confidential papers attached. For the men in Berlin, it was a rare gift from the gods of war. For the men in London, it was the most dangerous moment of their plan. The deception had left British hands the moment the sea delivered the corpse to the Spanish shore. Everything that followed, every decision, every whisper, now depended on human vanity, politics, and chance. In the small Andalusian port of Huelva, the fisherman who found the body said it looked like a man who had died trying to swim home. The Spanish authorities, unsure what to make of it, called the British vice-consul, Francis Haselden. He played his role with perfect desperation, insisting that the briefcase chained to the body must be returned immediately. His performance was half truth, half theater. The Spanish civil governor agreed to send the contents to the local naval command, and from there, word reached the German consulate. That was exactly what British intelligence had counted on. The Germans in Spain, especially Colonel Karl Erich Kalenthal, were skilled, ambitious, and certain of their importance. Kalenthal had been trying for months to earn Berlin's attention. When he heard of the drowned officer, he moved quickly. He bribed officials, arranged access to the documents, and telegraphed Berlin. British courier found dead. Personal papers intact. Strong indications of Allied plans in Eastern Mediterranean. In Berlin, the Abwehr, Hitler's military intelligence, buzzed like a hive. The photographs of the letters were flown from Madrid to the capital. Every page smelled faintly of sea salt and decay. The handwriting, the typewriters, even the folds in the paper, all consistent with genuine correspondence. The first letter, from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye of the War Office, hinted that Operation Brimstone was being planned in Greece, while a second described Sardinia as an important diversion. Together, they painted a picture of an Allied force preparing to strike the Balkans while feigning an interest in Sicily. When the analysis reached Hitler's desk, he grinned. "I told you," he said. "They'll go for Greece. The British are predictable. They'll always choose the indirect path." Some of his generals hesitated. "Mein Führer, Sicily remains the logical objective." "Logic is the trap of fools," Hitler interrupted. "This is intelligence. Authentic. Prepare our defenses." Within days, entire divisions began to move. Orders went out to reinforce Greece and the Aegean Islands. The 1st Panzer Division was withdrawn from France. Air squadrons were redeployed from Sicily to Crete. German and Italian units dug trenches on coastlines that would never see an enemy. In London, meanwhile, the men of Room 13 waited for confirmation that the ruse had worked. For weeks, silence. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park intercepted a transmission from Berlin to Athens. Führer convinced Allied attack imminent in Greece. Forces to be redirected immediately. Montague read the decrypted text twice. Then he sat back and said quietly, "They've swallowed it whole. No cheers. No champagne. Just the exhausted relief of people who knew that lies, once believed, could be more powerful than armies." The brilliance of Operation Mincemeat was that it played on emotion as much as logic. Hitler didn't want another disaster. He wanted to prove that he could still outthink his enemies. The documents had given him the story he needed to believe. Back in Spain, the body of Major William Martin was buried with full military honors. The British vice-consul attended the ceremony under a gray sky. The grave was marked with a simple inscription: Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Died in service of king and country, April 24, 1943. As the priest read the final prayer, a German observer stood among the small crowd, taking mental notes. To him, it was proof that the man and his papers were authentic. When the Spaniards finally returned the briefcase to the British Embassy, London studied it carefully. The seals had been broken and re-glued. The edges of the documents bore faint creases, evidence that someone had unfolded and refolded them. A report was sent to Room 13. Documents show signs of delicate tampering, indicate examination by unauthorized parties. Montague smiled for the first time in weeks. Perfect, he said. From that moment, every move in the Mediterranean war theater shifted. German reconnaissance focused on the wrong seas. Italian troops dug in along Greek beaches. Supply lines were rerouted, ships reassigned, and generals convinced that they had uncovered a priceless secret. They didn't realize they were following a dead man's orders. By early July, the deception reached its peak. While German and Italian troops braced for an assault in the Aegean, the real invasion fleet, Operation Husky, was forming in North Africa. More than 160,000 Allied troops prepared to land in Sicily, where defenses had been left dangerously thin. On July 9, 1943, as the first waves approached the Sicilian coast, Hitler was still fixated on Greece. He had sent an urgent order to the Balkans: reinforce the Peloponnese. Enemy invasion expected within days. The following morning, reports flooded in. Allied forces had landed not in Greece, but in Sicily. Confusion rippled through the German command. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The deception had bought the Allies precious time, and perhaps tens of thousands of lives. In the aftermath, Churchill received the coded success message from Eisenhower's headquarters: mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker. Churchill, delighted, scribbled a note to Montague. Not only was mincemeat successful, it was positively delicious. And yet, amid the celebration, one question lingered. Who was the man who had made it possible? Somewhere under the Spanish soil, beneath a stone carved with a false name, lay a body that had fooled the most powerful dictator on earth. He had no family, no medals, no story, except the one invented for him. His pockets still held the keys, the theater ticket, the photograph of Pam, the woman who never lived. Everything about him was a lie, but his lie had saved the truth. In the war rooms of London, as maps of Sicily filled with red Allied markers, Montague closed the file on Operation Mincemeat. "The man who never lived," he said softly, "has done more for the living than we ever could." Outside, the sirens of another air raid began to sound over the city. The war raged on. But somewhere in the noise of it, in the deception, the sacrifice, and the thin line between truth and illusion, one ghost had already changed its course. For years after the war, people left flowers on a grave in the quiet cemetery of Huelva, Spain. The stone read, "Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Died in service of his king and country, April 24, 1943. Tourists came, veterans came. Some even saluted. None of them knew that Major William Martin had never lived. The truth remained buried deep in British archives, locked under official secrets acts and silent oaths. To the world, he was the officer whose body washed ashore carrying papers that changed the course of the war. To the handful of men who knew better, he was something rarer, a ghost who saved the living. It wasn't until 1953, a decade after Operation Mincemeat, that the first hints of truth surfaced. Ewan Montague published a modest book titled The Man Who Never Was. He told the story, but not the whole of it. The real identity of the body remained secret, out of respect, or perhaps guilt. In the archives of St. Pancras Hospital, however, a clerk noticed an odd entry. GLYNDWR Michael, male, age 34. Cause of death, ingestion of phosphorus compound. A forgotten name, a quiet tragedy. A Welsh drifter who had died alone, poisoned by rat bait in an abandoned building. He had no family. No one claimed the body. So the British intelligence officers had claimed it for him. In death, he had become the perfect spy. Years later, when the files were finally declassified, the truth emerged. Journalists and historians pieced it together. The deception, the coffin, the forged love letters, the mission that fooled Hitler himself. And in Spain, the grave of Major Martin began receiving a different kind of visitor. Those who came not to honor a soldier, but to honor the man who never was. The British government quietly amended the inscription in 1998. Beneath the original epitaph, a new line was added. Glynndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, RM. It was an extraordinary gesture, one that closed the loop of the strangest story of the war. By then, most of the men who had conceived the plan were gone. Montague had returned to civilian life, always deflecting questions about whether he ever felt remorse. In an interview, he once said, "He gave more in death than most give in life." The operation's success was measured not in medals, but in lives. Thousands of Allied soldiers reached the beaches of Sicily with far less resistance because of one fabricated identity. Historians estimated that Operation Mincemeat shortened the war in Europe by months. And yet, in every retelling, there lingered something profoundly human. The uneasy question of whether the dead man, if he had been asked, would have agreed. The story of Glynndwr Michael is not one of glory. It is one of irony. A forgotten man, lost to despair, became one of the most effective weapons of deception in military history. His death, meaningless when it happened, became a turning point in a global conflict. Even now, in the cemetery by the sea, the waves that once carried him still wash against the Spanish shore. Fishermen pass by the graveyard, unaware that beneath the olive trees lies the man who fooled an empire. The sea air smells of salt and jasmine. The headstone is pale and worn. Visitors sometimes leave a single red poppy on the stone, for the soldier who wasn't, and for the life that almost no one remembered. Every war produces its ghosts. Most fade into history. But one remained, forever half alive, half imagined. The man who never lived, and yet, somehow, never truly died. He had no uniform, no medals, no fame. Just a story, one that still whispers, softly, across the tide. He never lived, and yet, he saved thousands who did.